On the morning of November 25th, 1944, the sky over America was bright with the clean cold of late autumn. Newspapers rustled across mess hall tables in the towns near the camps, their headlines filled with war updates, Allied forces pushing into the Ardennes, rumors of a German counteroffensive, rationing charts for butter and sugar. Yet, behind barbed wire fences in the American Midwest, a scene unfolded that seemed to belong to another world entirely. German women, prisoners of war, captured auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, and camp followers swept up in the collapse of the Reich's African and European fronts, were lining up with tin trays in their hands, waiting for something they never imagined they would see in captivity: a Thanksgiving feast. The strangeness of it all struck them at once. They had been transported across the Atlantic in sealed holds, expecting punishment, maybe hunger, perhaps even cruelty. Nazi propaganda had assured them that capture by Americans meant degradation, starvation, or worse. Instead, the scent that greeted them was roasted turkey, rich, savory, almost dizzying in its unfamiliar warmth. The women glanced at one another in disbelief, lips tightening in an attempt to mask their astonishment. The guards, young American farm boys wearing olive drab, looked almost amused at their confusion. One of them, barely 20, quipped to his comrade, "They look like they're seeing a ghost bird." The words earned a chuckle, but the irony was thick. The prisoners were about to eat better than many civilians in war-torn Europe. Inside the camp dining hall, long wooden tables were covered with white paper sheets. On each, steaming dishes waited to be carried forward. Bowls of mashed potatoes whipped with real cream, cranberry sauce so bright it seemed painted, pumpkin pies glistening with sugar, and gravy that smelled of fat and flour browned together until nutty. A woman in her late 20s, her hair still tightly braided in regulation fashion, whispered to the one behind her, "Es riecht wie ein Fest, wie Weihnachten. It smells like a celebration." She hadn't tasted meat like that since before the war, and certainly not in the past year, when Germany's rations had reduced dinners to little more than watery soups and ersatz bread. When their turn came, the American cooks ladled generous portions without hesitation. There was no mockery, no hesitation, just the rhythm of service, as though this act were routine. The women sat on benches, trays before them, hands hovering in uncertain reverence. Some bowed their heads in silent prayer, instinctive remnants of home. Others simply stared at the bird's golden skin, the thin steam rising in lazy curls. Forks scraped at last, and the hall filled with the sound of cautious chewing, then hurried swallowing. The first taste was enough to unravel their guarded expressions. Eyelids fluttered, shoulders lowered. For a moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. Yet even amid that abundance, unease persisted. The central conflict was not hunger, it was trust. Could this be real? Was this kindness genuine or simply a trick, a propaganda stage play designed to soften them? In Germany, they had been taught that Americans were greedy, cruel capitalists, indifferent to suffering. But here, their supposed enemies had carved turkey for them, served them pie, even poured coffee strong enough to smell of earth and smoke. One woman, a former Red Cross nurse from Hamburg, admitted later in a diary smuggled back to Europe, "It confused me more than any leaflet or speech. How could they feed us like this while our children starved?" The guards moved among them, not hostile, not warm either, but professional. A few cracked jokes, commenting on the size of portions. "Don't worry, plenty more birds where that came from," one said, tipping his hat. The humor was dry, almost Midwestern plain, but to the prisoners it seemed surreal, this casual abundance, this idea that there was always more. In Germany, there was never more. There was only less each week, each month, as the war dragged on. The room's atmosphere began to shift. Some women ate quickly, driven by instinct to consume before the food vanished, as though it might be a dream. Others slowed, savoring each bite, trying to commit the flavors to memory. The buttery slide of mashed potatoes, the sweetness of cranberry sharp on the tongue, the crisp crust of pie that crumbled delicately. A few exchanged glances that carried questions deeper than words. What if everything we had been told was false? What if the enemy's strength was not only in weapons, but in this unshakable confidence, this luxury of giving feasts even to prisoners? One could not ignore the irony. Beyond the fences, African-American soldiers stationed nearby sometimes received less generous rations, and families back in Europe counted scraps. But here, in the curious space of a POW camp, abundance reigned. The juxtaposition left an imprint sharper than any rifle shot. It was not merely food, it was ideology plated on tin. The women's thoughts drifted as they ate. Some pictured their families in bombed-out tenements, their mothers stirring thin soups of turnips and cabbage. One imagined her little brother's hollow cheeks, the ration card folded like a treasure in his hand. She bit into another forkful of turkey, and tears threatened to break loose. To taste such wealth here, as a prisoner, while her family starved, was almost unbearable. She pressed her lips together and kept chewing, not daring to waste even a morsel. For the Americans, it was simply Thanksgiving, and tradition demanded generosity. They saw no contradiction in extending that tradition to the captured. Perhaps it was efficiency, perhaps adherence to the Geneva Convention, perhaps a subtle psychological campaign. Whatever the reason, it worked. The women left that hall changed, unsettled in ways they could not articulate. One later recalled, "The meal filled our stomachs, but it emptied something else, the certainty of what we thought we knew." When the plates were cleared and the women returned to their barracks, the air outside was sharp with frost. Overhead, the sky was vast, streaked with gray clouds, indifferent to their bewilderment. The guards herded them with calm voices, no shouting, just routine. And yet, within each prisoner, something restless stirred. They whispered among themselves in low German, debating whether this was a one-time indulgence or a glimpse into the strange reality of America. Some laughed bitterly, calling it a trick. Others said nothing, too busy holding on to the taste still lingering on their tongues. In the quiet of the barracks, one woman traced the memory of the meal as if it were a photograph. She thought of her mother, of the lines outside bakeries back home, of the empty shelves. She imagined writing a letter describing the turkey, but she knew she could not. It would break her family's spirit. Better to remain silent, to let the taste exist only in her own memory. But she also knew she would never forget it. Never erase the image of enemy soldiers carving meat with practiced ease, offering it as though it were nothing. The night settled heavy, the camp lights casting halos against the wire. Some of the women lay awake, not from hunger but from confusion. The enemy had fed them like honored guests. The war had told them one story. The meal whispered another, and beneath the clatter of trays and the faint echo of laughter from the guards, an unspoken question hung in the cold air. If America could serve its prisoners turkey in the middle of a world at war, what else might it be capable of? The answer, they suspected, would come soon enough, and it would shake them even more deeply than a holiday feast ever could. Back in Germany, the tables were nearly bare. By late 1944, families huddled in cold kitchens, ration cards clutched in their hands like relics of hope, waiting for scraps that never quite satisfied. A mother might tear a card carefully, counting portions with the precision of a jeweler, only to find that the baker's shelves were empty of wheat. Ersatz bread, half sawdust, half rye, was all she could offer her children. Coffee had long ago become a bitter concoction of roasted acorns and barley. Meat, once a symbol of Sunday feasts, appeared rarely, often in the form of horseflesh or thin sausage that tasted more of fillers than flesh. In many cities, even turnips had vanished. Hunger became the common language of the Reich, and yet Thousands of miles away, their captured daughters found themselves staring at meals of staggering abundance. The contrast was so sharp it bordered on cruelty, though the Americans had no such intention. Inside the U.S. camps, roast beef appeared on ordinary Tuesdays. Butter and jam came with breakfast, and milk was served in pitchers so full they sloshed as they were carried. The women would take their trays and glance at one another, torn between gratitude and guilt. Each bite tasted not only of food but of betrayal. Betrayal of family left behind to starve in bombed-out apartments. One young prisoner whispered, "If my mother saw what I eat here, she would think I have joined the enemy." The abundance was not accidental. America in 1944 was a land of barns swollen with grain and warehouses stacked with canned goods. Its farms, mechanized and largely untouched by bombing, produced more than any nation in the world. While Europe dug potatoes from frozen soil, the Midwest reaped fields of corn and wheat that seemed endless. Official reports from the U.S. Department of Agriculture listed surpluses measured in millions of bushels. Even with rationing at home, Americans ate better than most of the world's civilians, and the Geneva Convention required that prisoners be fed comparably to the troops guarding them. Thus, by law and by capacity, German women POWs ate meals that eclipsed the diets of their own officers back in Europe. The strangeness of this reality pressed on them each day. In the barracks, they wrote letters they dared not describe fully. "We are treated decently," one wrote, "and there is enough to eat." She left out the details: the thick slices of roast pork, the eggs fried in butter, the occasional slice of cake. To confess such luxury would be an insult to those at home, where children's ribs showed beneath thin shirts. Silence became a form of loyalty, a way of protecting fragile morale across the ocean. Still, their consciences wrestled with the contradiction. They were prisoners, yet their stomachs were full. Their families were free, yet their cupboards were empty. That imbalance gnawed more deeply than hunger ever could. Some resolved the conflict by dismissing it as manipulation, a cynical American trick to weaken them. Others allowed doubt to seep in slowly, realizing that generosity could be its own kind of power. For the first time, they glimpsed a different world, one where food was not rationed to the bone, where confidence came not from slogans, but from the ability to waste nothing and still have more. There were moments of humor, too, born of disbelief. One guard remembered a German woman who stared at a mound of mashed potatoes as though it might attack her. When urged to eat, she muttered, "Too much for one person." The guard laughed and said, "That's just the appetizer." The exchange was retold in the camp for weeks, a story that carried both amusement and unease. The POWs had grown up measuring every crumb. Here, abundance was almost comical. Another woman confessed to a fellow prisoner that she felt guilty scraping her tray clean, not because she was ashamed to eat, but because she wished she could slip the leftovers into an envelope and mail them to Bremen. The meals became more than sustenance. They were lessons, silent but profound. Each tray of food demonstrated America's industrial might more effectively than a fleet of bombers. If the U.S. could feed its prisoners like this, what else could it do? The message sank in without lectures or pamphlets. It was propaganda by plate, persuasion by pumpkin pie. Even those who resisted the implication could not ignore the evidence before their eyes. Numbers told part of the story. Germany rationed meat at 250 grams per week per adult, less than a single American hamburger. In many cities, civilians survived on 1,500 calories a day, sometimes less. In the camps, women consumed nearly double that, with steady supplies of protein and fat. Their bodies betrayed the truth. Cheeks filled, hair regained its luster. Menstrual cycles returned after months of malnutrition. For some, it was the cruelest revelation of all, that they grew healthier in captivity than they had been in freedom. Letters intercepted by censors revealed the strain. A woman wrote, "Do not worry about me, I am well." That word, well, was a code heavy with unspoken detail. It meant full, it meant safe, it meant stronger than those at home. And yet, the same woman tucked away pieces of bread during meals, drying them in her barracks to save for nights when the guilt pressed too hard. Hunger was not just about the stomach. It was about identity, about who deserved what. In that sense, captivity challenged them more deeply than chains ever could. The conflict sharpened when news from home arrived. One woman read that her sister had fainted while queuing for potatoes in Berlin. Another learned that her father had slaughtered the family's last goat for soup. They held these letters in trembling hands, the ink smudged with tears, then walked to dinner and faced plates piled high. The taste of roast beef turned to ash in their mouths. Some forced themselves to eat quickly, reasoning that waste was worse. Others pushed food aside, appetite ruined by guilt. The hall grew quieter on those days, the abundance no longer a gift, but a burden. Yet beneath the sorrow, another feeling grew. Respect. However grudging, however reluctant, they could not deny that America's wealth was real. It was not staged, not borrowed, but woven into the very soil. And with each passing meal, the certainty of Nazi promises eroded. The Reich had promised victory and delivered hunger. America, the supposed enemy, offered prisoners turkey. Which voice, they began to wonder, carried more truth? This shift did not happen overnight. Some clung fiercely to old beliefs, whispering that the feasts were traps, that one day the tables would vanish and punishment would fall. But most felt something subtler, the unsettling awareness that the world was larger than they had been taught. And perhaps kinder, too. Even if the kindness was pragmatic, even if it came from the enemy, it had weight. The barracks whispered with stories long after lights out. Some women laughed at their own astonishment. Others cried quietly into their pillows. All felt the dissonance pressing on them, as inescapable as the barbed wire outside. They had stepped from ruins into plenty, and that step had cracked something deep inside. As winter deepened and Christmas approached, rumors spread that another feast might come. The thought lingered in the air like smoke. Would the Americans serve them turkey again? Would they bring gifts of food while families at home shivered in hunger? The very possibility was unsettling, almost frightening, because it suggested that this new reality was not a dream at all, but a pattern. And if that were true, it begged a question none dared speak aloud. What if captivity offered more hope than freedom? Life inside the American camps unfolded with a rhythm that both soothed and unsettled the German women. Each day began with the metallic clang of the guard's bell, echoing across the compound just as the sun began to bleed light over the barbed wire fences. The women stirred from their bunks, wrapped in wool blankets that smelled faintly of mothballs and soap, their breaths visible in the winter air. Outside, boots crunched over frost as guards marched their rounds. It was not freedom, but it was not the hell they had been warned of either. The strange middle ground of captivity was its own battlefield. One fought not with rifles, but with customs, expectations, and clashing identities. Meals punctuated the day like drumbeats, and the tension around them never quite faded. Breakfast trays offered oatmeal, toast with butter, sometimes even eggs. To women who had grown used to hunger, it felt almost indecent. Yet the act of eating was rarely pure enjoyment. A few ate heartily, surrendering to appetite, while others picked at their food with the guarded precision of people still suspicious of abundance. Conversations at the tables revealed the fracture lines. "This is nothing but manipulation," muttered one, her eyes sharp with loyalty to the Reich. "They want us fat and foolish, so we forget who we are." Across from her, another woman swallowed a bite of buttered bread and replied softly, "Perhaps they want nothing but to show us who they are." Neither convinced the other, and silence followed, thick as smoke. Beyond the dining hall, daily life offered unexpected encounters. The camps were not merely cages. They were peculiar microcosms of American society transplanted into the heartland. Education programs sprang up, sponsored by the U.S. military in part to occupy idle hands, in part to plant seeds of new ideas. Classrooms were set up in converted barracks, chalk dust hanging in the air as English phrases were written on the board. Some women attended eagerly, curious to untangle the language of their captors, repeating words like freedom and opportunity, with accents heavy but growing lighter. Others refused outright, insisting that to learn was to betray. The divide grew sharper with each lesson, and friendships splintered quietly, some bound by old ideology, others by new curiosity. The guards, most of them young men barely older than the prisoners, added another layer of complexity. For the most part, they maintained a firm distance, treating the women with professional restraint. But distance could not erase humanity. A casual remark, a shared laugh, a small gesture of kindness, all blurred the lines between enemy and ordinary neighbor. One afternoon, a guard brought out a phonograph and set it playing outside the mess hall. American swing music crackled from the speaker, filling the air with trumpets and rhythm. The women gathered hesitantly, some covering their ears at first, others swaying despite themselves. A few laughed aloud, a sound so rare it startled even them. "This is madness," one whispered, smiling despite her protest. "To dance with the enemy's music." Yet her feet tapped on the dusty ground all the same. Cultural clashes emerged everywhere. In one camp, the women insisted on maintaining rigid routines of cleanliness and order, folding blankets with military precision and scrubbing barrack floors until they gleamed. When the Americans teased them for their severity, they bristled. "We are not animals," one snapped. Yet there was pride hidden in the defiance, a need to cling to dignity. In another instance, a camp canteen began offering Coca-Cola, and the women stared at the dark, fizzy drink as though it were a potion. Tentatively, one tasted it and nearly choked, the sweetness too sharp, too strange. Soon, however, it became a novelty, and laughter rippled as prisoners compared the American drink to cough syrup. Small moments like these turned captivity into a series of negotiations, each sip or song a choice between rejection and adaptation. The Red Cross visited often, inspecting conditions and reporting back to Geneva. Their presence reassured the women, though it also reminded them of their status. They were not guests. They were prisoners. The barbed wire glittered under snow, and the guard towers cast long shadows. Attempts to escape were rare, almost unthinkable for women brought across an ocean, but the fences symbolized an undeniable truth. No matter how plentiful the meals or gentle the routines, they were not free. That truth gnawed at them, even as they grew stronger and healthier in captivity. The inner conflict deepened when letters from home revealed suffering in sharper tones. One woman, Ilsa, received word that her father had died in a bombing raid. She clutched the paper in her hands until it tore, then sat silently at her bunk while the smell of roast chicken drifted from the mess hall. She could not bring herself to eat that night, the injustice too cruel. Her friend Anna, seated beside her, whispered, "He would want you to eat." Ilsa shook her head. "He would not want me to eat better than my brothers in the trenches." The tension between survival and solidarity stretched thin, snapping in conversations and in silence. Not all women resisted. Some began to soften, finding in the small comforts of camp life a refuge they dared not admit to enjoying. They embroidered, read books from camp libraries, even attended lectures on democracy offered by professors drafted into service. One woman later recalled that hearing the word rights, explained with such conviction, unsettled her more than any bombing raid. She had been told that America was decadent, immoral, collapsing under chaos. Yet here was order, structure, abundance, and ideas that rang with a kind of stubborn clarity. She wrote in her diary, It is more dangerous to be fed by your enemy than to be starved by your friend. Hunger hardens. Generosity confuses. Still, loyalty clung stubbornly to many. In the shadows of the barracks, whispered songs of the old homeland rose, hushed but defiant. Some saluted secretly, reminding each other that they belonged to something larger than this camp. They mocked the women who learned English, calling them weak. Divisions sharpened. Those who saw food and kindness as weapons, and those who saw them as bridges. The camp became a reflection of the larger war, an ideological struggle contained within fences. And yet, the guards noticed a shift. Where once the women looked away, eyes cold and distant, some now met their gazes. Where once silence ruled, now conversations flickered to life. A guard from Iowa recalled, "They argued a lot, but they also laughed more. It was the laughter that made you realize they weren't the same as when they arrived." That laughter, small and fleeting, marked a transformation neither side could deny. Evenings carried their own rituals. After supper, the women gathered in circles, mending clothes, sharing stories of home. Some told tales of childhood summers by rivers, of fathers who played music, of festivals before the war. Others spoke bitterly of bombings, of hunger, of brothers killed. The stories braided together, weaving grief with nostalgia. In those moments, the fences seemed thinner, their identities not only as prisoners or Germans, but as human beings suspended in a strange twilight between past and future. Cultural clashes sometimes erupted into small conflicts. Once, a group of women refused to stand for the playing of the American anthem during a camp ceremony. Guards grew tense, the atmosphere crackling. But instead of punishment, the Americans let the silence stretch until the music ended. The women were left unsettled, unsure whether they had won or lost. In another moment, American women volunteers entered the camp to teach sewing, and the prisoners stared at them with curiosity, comparing their clothing, their speech, their easy laughter. The encounter was not hostile, but it left the German women restless. They saw in those volunteers a vision of womanhood free from the strict discipline of the Reich. Confident, unashamed, ordinary. It was both enviable and threatening. The seasons shifted, snow giving way to spring. Gardens bloomed outside the fences, tended by farmers whose fields stretched to horizons. The prisoners saw those fields every day and thought of their own ruined landscapes back home. The sight was painful, yet strangely comforting. It reminded them that somewhere life grew undisturbed, far from rubble. For some, that image became a symbol of what might be possible beyond war. For others, it was salt in a wound that would not heal. The days blurred together, but beneath the routine, the transformation was undeniable. Camp life was not merely survival. It was confrontation with a reality that challenged every certainty they had carried across the Atlantic. The cultural clashes were not loud battles, but quiet, relentless skirmishes between hunger and abundance, pride and humility, loyalty and doubt. Each meal, each lesson, each song from a phonograph chipped away at old walls, even as new walls of guilt, of confusion, rose in their place. As night fell one evening, the women lay in their bunks, the faint hum of swing music drifting from a guard's radio outside. Some listened with closed eyes, others covered their ears, but all felt the same gnawing truth. Something inside them was shifting. They did not yet know whether it was betrayal or awakening, only that it was irreversible. And just as they began to grow accustomed to this strange equilibrium, rumors spread through the barracks. Rumors of an approaching holiday, of another feast. The thought stirred both dread and anticipation. For if a simple turkey dinner had already unsettled their beliefs, what would come next threatened to unseat them entirely. The memory of that first turkey dinner never left them. It lingered long after the flavors faded, like a ghost that haunted every meal that followed. For some, it became a symbol of survival, proof that fate had spared them from hunger's cruelty. For others, it was a burden, a reminder that they were eating while their families withered in the ruins of Europe. By the spring of 1945, this paradox had deepened into something far greater than hunger. It had become a question of identity, of what it meant to be German, to be captive, to be human in a war that seemed to erase all definitions. Ilse carried the memory with her, like a secret wound. Each evening, when trays clattered and bowls of stew or chicken appeared, she thought of her father's death under the bombs. She thought of her mother boiling turnips, her younger brother scraping plates clean for lack of more. Every bite became both salvation and betrayal. She ate because she must, because to refuse would change nothing. Yet the guilt pressed against her ribs like an iron band. Anna, her closest friend in the camp, noticed the way Ilse's eyes dimmed during meals. One night she whispered, "You cannot starve yourself into loyalty. Your family would want you alive." Ilse only shook her head, unwilling to admit that survival itself now felt like treachery. Others responded differently. Greta, younger and more curious, found herself fascinated not just by the food, but by everything the camp revealed. She attended the English classes, repeating new words until they rolled smoothly from her tongue. She devoured books from the camp library, stories of American pioneers and democracy explained in simple terms. At first, she treated it like a game, a way to pass long hours. But as weeks turned to months, the words began to shape thoughts she had never dared consider. One afternoon, she confided to Anna, "They believe their leaders must answer to them. Imagine such a thing, people questioning power and not being punished for it." Anna frowned, cautious. "Careful, Greta. These ideas are dangerous." Greta only smiled faintly. Perhaps danger is not always what we think. The central conflict of camp life shifted steadily from hunger to ideology. Where once they argued about food, now they argued about meaning. Was America's generosity genuine or calculated? Did these lessons and lectures represent truth or manipulation? The divisions grew visible. Some clung stubbornly to the old certainties, whispering songs of loyalty, saluting in secret. Others allowed doubt to creep in, their walls cracked by pie crusts and swing music. Between them stretched an invisible trench, deeper than any dug in the fields of Europe. Letters from home sharpened the tension. The war was closing in on Germany. Every line spoke of shortages, rubble, despair. "We burned furniture to stay warm," one mother wrote. "Your cousin traded her wedding ring for a sack of flour." The women read these words with tears they tried to hide. Their trays, meanwhile, groaned with food. Some stuffed bread into their pockets, still driven by instinct to hoard. Others pushed their meals away, appetite ruined by guilt. But none could escape the truth that captivity had nourished them, while freedom had starved their families. The irony was unbearable, and it etched itself into memory with a permanence no bomb could erase. In that contradiction lay transformation. For Ilse, it hardened into sorrow that would never leave her. For Greta, it sparked curiosity that would outlive the fences. For Anna, it became a balancing act, holding loyalty in one hand and awareness in the other. Each woman wrestled with the same question in different ways. What did it mean that their enemy fed them better than their homeland ever could? The Americans did not lecture often, but their actions spoke louder than any words. The women saw guards who joked easily, who played music, who did not strike them down for speaking. They saw farmers outside the fences tending fields of unimaginable abundance, their barns filled even as Europe emptied. They saw American women volunteers, smiling and confident, unafraid to meet their eyes. These images accumulated like stones, building a weight that could not be ignored. And slowly, though they did not admit it openly, the women began to compare. Germany promised glory, but delivered hunger. America, for all its flaws, showed them turkey on Thanksgiving. By summer, as rumors of Germany's collapse spread, the change became visible. Some women spoke English freely now, trading words with guards, even laughing at jokes. Others withdrew, angered by what they saw as betrayal within their own ranks. The camp became a mirror of the war's larger fracture. Those who believed still, and those who no longer could. Greta stood one evening beneath the fading light and told Anna quietly, "I think I will never see the world the same way again." Anna hesitated before replying, "Nor will I. But what world will there be to see when we return?" When the surrender finally came in May, the news spread through the camp like a storm. Some collapsed in tears, others sang defiantly, clinging to pride in defeat. The Americans announced it without triumph, almost gently, as though they understood the weight of such knowledge. That night, the women lay awake in silence. The war's end, a beginning they could not yet fathom. Ilse stared at the ceiling and whispered to herself, "If my father had lived, what would he say of this?" Greta pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed not by sorrow, but by the sudden enormity of possibility. Anna sat between them, torn as always, loyal yet restless. The lessons of captivity did not vanish with the war's end. For years afterward, the women would remember the meals most vividly. Ilse would speak of them with bitterness, reminders of what she lost. Greta would recall them with wonder, stepping stones to a new way of thinking. Anna would remember them with conflict, unable to reconcile kindness with the barbed wire that delivered it. Each carried the memory like a scar, visible only in the quiet moments when the taste of turkey returned unbidden. And so the transformation took shape. It was not sudden, not dramatic, but steady and undeniable. They had entered the camps expecting brutality and hunger. They left with a vision of abundance and contradiction that unsettled their very foundations. Food had become more than nourishment. It had been a weapon, a teacher, a mirror. It had revealed truths more dangerous than any bullet. That generosity could disarm more effectively than violence. That ideology could crumble under the weight of a full plate. That kindness, calculated or genuine, left deeper marks than cruelty. On their final night before transport back to Europe, the women gathered in the barracks, whispering as they had so many nights before. They spoke of families, of homes reduced to rubble, of fears for what awaited them. And inevitably, they spoke of the meals. Some laughed quietly, recalling their first sight of turkey. Others fell silent, tears streaking their cheeks in the dim light. Greta leaned forward, her voice trembling but steady. "Do you not see?" she asked softly. "They wanted us to remember. Not the fences, not the guards. The meals, the feeling of plenty. They wanted us to carry it with us, like a seed." Ilse shook her head bitterly, unable to accept the thought. Anna closed her eyes, torn between them, knowing that both spoke truths. The transport came at dawn, engines rumbling, boots echoing. As the women boarded, they turned back one last time to look at the camp. The fences glistened with dew, the guard towers still and watchful, the mess hall quiet. But, in their minds, the smell of turkey lingered, as vivid as the day they first encountered it. It was not simply a memory of food. It was a memory of confusion, of doubt, of revelation. It was the battlefield they had not chosen, but one they could never leave behind. And as the trucks rolled away, carrying them back toward a shattered homeland, the question remained lodged within each of them, unresolved and inescapable. If the enemy had fed them like family, what would they find when they returned to their own?